Welcome to the podcast. I'm David Jolly, and today we're exploring a fascinating chapter in American history, the Constitutional Convention's decision to conduct their deliberations behind closed doors. While secrecy in politics certainly isn't uncommon, this is the story of how 55 delegates gathered for 4 months went beyond their original mandate and fundamentally reshaped the American system of government. It's an account of political pragmatism, bold decision-making, and the tensions between following instructions and following conviction. All right, let's go back to May 25th, 1787. And if you're walking past the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, well, you might notice something a little bit odd. The windows on the second floor are shut tight despite the growing summer heat. Armed guards are posted at the doors. No visitors are allowed in, and no information is coming out. It kind of sounds like the movie Conclave. Anyway, the city's newspapers, usually full of political gossip, have gone mysteriously quiet about what's happening inside. The delegates have been sent to Philadelphia with very specific, very limited instructions. Fix the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were America's first constitution, created during the Revolutionary War, and they were failing spectacularly. The federal government could not tax, could not regulate trade between states, and could not enforce its own laws. States were printing their own money, fighting trade wars with each other, and ignoring federal treaties. But here's the thing. The delegates were supposed to propose amendments to the Articles, not throw them out entirely. Their official mandate, approved by the Continental Congress, was to meet for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. That's it. Revision. Not revolution. Instead, they decided to start over from scratch. On the very first day of real business, Edmund Randolph of Virginia stood up and presented what became known as the Virginia Plan, a completely new form of government with a bicameral legislature, a national executive, and a federal judiciary. This wasn't revision, this was constitutional regime change. The delegates knew exactly how radical they were being. Governor Morris later admitted they had exceeded their powers. Alexander Hamilton acknowledged that they were going beyond their commission. James Madison, the convention's chief architect, wrote privately that they were treading on forbidden ground. So why the secrecy? Well, the official reason was to encourage free and open debate. George Washington, serving as the convention's president, argued that delegates needed to be able to speak their minds without worrying about public reaction to every statement. If newspapers were reporting their daily deliberations, delegates might grandstand for their home audiences instead of engaging in honest negotiation. And this made sense, especially given how contentious the issues were. The delegates were arguing about slavery, representation, federal power, and the basic structure of government. These weren't abstract theoretical debates. They were fights that could literally tear the country apart. If the public knew how close the convention came to collapsing several times, well, it might have undermined confidence in the entire process. But there was a deeper, more troubling reason for secrecy. What they were doing was, well, probably illegal. The Articles of Confederation required unanimous consent from all 13 states to make any changes. But Rhode Island had boycotted the convention entirely, and several other states had sent delegates with strict instructions not to exceed their authority. By creating an entirely new constitution and declaring that it would go into effect when just 9 states ratified it, the delegates were essentially staging a peaceful coup. They were overthrowing the existing legal order and replacing it with something completely different. In the context of 18th century political thinking, this was the definition of revolution. The secrecy rule was adopted on the convention's first day, and it was enforced with military precision. Each delegate took a formal oath not to reveal the proceedings. Guards were posted at all entrances. The windows were kept shut and even nailed closed in some cases, turning the assembly hall into a sweltering hotbox during Philadelphia's brutal summer heat. The no-leaks policy was remarkably effective. Despite having 55 delegates from 12 different states, virtually nothing about the convention's deliberations appeared in newspapers until after it was over. This is almost miraculous when you consider that 18th century politicians were just as prone to leaking as modern ones, and Philadelphia was a city full of taverns where loose tongues were common. Well, there were a few close calls. At one point, a delegate dropped some notes on the convention floor, and George Washington himself picked them up. The next day, Washington sternly lectured the delegates about secrecy, warning that such carelessness could undermine the entire effort. William Jackson, the convention's secretary, was so committed to secrecy that he burned most of his notes at the end of the proceedings. This means our knowledge of what actually happened inside comes mainly from James Madison's private notes, which weren't published until 1840, more than 50 years later. The secrecy created some, awkward situations. Delegates' families and constituents back home were constantly asking what was happening in Philadelphia. The delegates had to come up with creative non-answers. When someone asked Benjamin Franklin what kind of government they were creating, he supposedly replied, "A republic, if you can keep it," a response that revealed nothing while sounding, profound. The press was particularly frustrated. Newspapers had expected to cover the convention extensively, but they found themselves shut out completely. Some tried to gather information by interviewing delegates in Philadelphia taverns, but the delegates had apparently learned to keep their mouths shut, even after a few drinks. The secrecy policy also created a public relations problem. Americans had just fought a revolution against secretive, unaccountable government. The idea that their own leaders were meeting behind closed doors to remake their government was deeply troubling to many people. Anti-Federalists later used the convention's secrecy as evidence that the Constitution was the product of an elite conspiracy against popular government. Patrick Henry of Virginia, who had refused to attend the convention because he smelled a rat, argued that the secrecy proved the delegates were up to no good. How could Americans trust a constitution created by men who wouldn't let the public see how they made it? And this criticism had real bite. The whole American political tradition was based on the idea that legitimate government required popular consent. But how could the people consent to something that they knew nothing about? After all, the delegates were asking Americans to approve a new form of government without even knowing how or why it was created. The defenders of secrecy made practical arguments. James Wilson pointed out that if the deliberations had been public, the clamors of faction would have prevented any satisfactory result. Alexander Hamilton argued that premature disclosure would have allowed opponents to organize against the Constitution before it was even finished. But these practical justifications couldn't hide the deeper contradiction. The most democratic nation on earth had created its fundamental law through a profoundly undemocratic process. The secrecy also meant that when the Constitution was finally revealed in September 1787, it came as a complete shock to most Americans. They had expected amendments to the Articles of Confederation, not an entirely new system of government. The surprise factor made ratification both easier and harder. Easier because opponents had less time to organize, but harder because many people felt blindsided by the radical changes. Interestingly, the convention's secrecy may have actually improved the final product. Social scientists have studied group decision-making extensively, and they've found that secrecy often leads to better outcomes when dealing with complex, controversial issues. Without public pressure, the delegates could focus on solving problems rather than positioning themselves politically. The secrecy also allowed for genuine compromise. Delegates could change their minds, admit mistakes, and make deals without worrying about looking inconsistent to their constituents. Some of the convention's most important breakthroughs came when delegates abandoned positions they had previously defended in public. But secrecy came with costs that extended far beyond the convention itself. By meeting behind closed doors, the delegates created a precedent for elite decision-making that would influence American politics for centuries. The secrecy also contributed to ongoing conspiracy theories about the Constitution's origins. Because so little was known about what actually happened inside the convention, it was easy for later generations to project their own theories onto the process. Some claim the Constitution was a plutocratic conspiracy, while others argued it was a democratic revolution. The truth was probably more mundane. It was a group of politicians trying to solve practical problems while advancing their own interests. Looking back, the secrecy of the Constitutional Convention was probably both necessary and problematic. Necessary because open deliberations might have made compromise impossible and exposed the delegates to political pressure that could have prevented any agreement. Problematic because it established precedents for elite decision-making that conflicted with democratic ideals. The real test of the convention's secrecy came during the ratification debates when the Constitution was finally subjected to public scrutiny. In town halls, newspapers, and state conventions across America, ordinary citizens debated the merits of the document that their leaders had created in secret. This public ratification process helped legitimize what had been created through private deliberation. In the end, the Constitutional Convention's secrecy was a calculated gamble that paid off. The delegates created a constitution that has lasted longer than any other written constitution in world history.